strangest thing about Tutankhamun's tomb is not the gold, the mask, or the fact that it survived when so many royal burials were destroyed. The strangest thing is that it does not look like the tomb of a king who should have changed history. For more than a century, the world has treated KV-62 as the great miracle of Egyptian archaeology, the one royal burial that escaped almost intact. But if you strip away the treasure and look only at the architecture, the decoration, and the scientific surveys carried out in the last decade, the tomb begins to tell a more unsettling story. It is too small, too unusual in plan, and too awkwardly arranged for a pharaoh of the late 18th dynasty. Then, modern scanning technology entered the burial chamber and seemed to show something that should not have been there at all. Traces suggesting that the painted walls of the most famous tomb on Earth might once have concealed sealed passages. What followed was not a clean discovery, but a collision between archaeology, technology, interpretation, and uncertainty. And that is what makes this story so compelling. Not that a hidden room has definitely been found, but that the evidence has forced scholars to ask whether the world's best-known ancient tomb may never have been fully understood in the first place. When Howard Carter's team discovered the entrance to KV-62 in November 1922, they found something Egyptologists had almost stopped expecting, a royal tomb that still contained a dense concentration of burial goods. The valley had been explored for generations, and many royal tombs had been entered, robbed, reused, or damaged in antiquity. Yet here was a sealed burial of a relatively obscure king, Tutankhamun, tucked beneath debris and workmen's huts near the tomb of Ramesses VI. Carter's notebooks and the archive preserved at the Griffith Institute document the discovery in meticulous detail. What he and his team uncovered over the following years transformed public understanding of ancient Egypt. More than 5,000 objects were recorded from the tomb and its annexes, including shrines, chariots, beds, statues, jewelry, ceremonial equipment, clothing, weaponry, and the nested coffins that enclosed the mummy of the young king. The scale of preservation was extraordinary, but even in the first flush of discovery, the architecture itself stood out as odd. The tomb did not unfold in the grand sequence expected of a major royal burial. It consisted of a staircase, a corridor, an antechamber, a smaller annex, the burial chamber, and the treasury beyond. By the standards of New Kingdom kingship, this was compact, almost improvised. That awkwardness mattered because tomb architecture in the Valley of the Kings was never random. It carried religious, political, and practical meaning. Royal tombs of the 18th dynasty often developed through planned corridors, chambers, and carefully organized decorative programs. KV-62, by contrast, feels constrained. The burial chamber is the only decorated room. The spaces are limited. The route into the tomb is shorter and less monumental than many scholars would expect for a pharaoh. For decades, the simplest explanation was also the most persuasive one. Tutankhamun died young and unexpectedly, probably around the age of 19, and his court had to bury him quickly. In that view, the tomb was a practical solution to a crisis. A smaller tomb was adapted because a larger royal tomb was not ready. That explanation remains plausible, and many Egyptologists still accept some version of it. But the problem is that once you accept adaptation, a second question immediately follows. Adapted from what? And for whom? If the tomb was not originally intended for Tutankhamun, then the physical evidence inside it may preserve traces of a previous plan, a previous owner, or a hurried repurposing at the moment of a political emergency. That possibility became much more important because Tutankhamun lived at the end of one of the most unstable periods in Egyptian history. He was born into the aftermath of the Amarna Revolution, when Akhenaten had upended traditional religion, elevated the solar god Aten, and shifted the royal court to a new capital at Amarna. The old priesthoods, especially that of Amun, lost influence. Royal imagery changed dramatically. Then, within a short span, the entire experiment began to collapse. Tutankhamun, who began life as Tutankhaten, eventually restored the old cults and returned the court toward traditional religious structures. He died before he could build a long reign or leave a stable succession. The elderly courtier Ai followed him. After Ai came Horemheb, who actively erased much of the Amarna episode from official memory. This matters because the late 18th dynasty produced royal identities that remain difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Nefertiti, Ankhesenamun, Smenkhkare, Neferneferuaten, Ai, Tutankhamun, and Horemheb all sit within a compressed and politically sensitive period of succession. When a tomb from this era looks architecturally wrong, scholars do not see only a practical inconvenience. They see the possibility that the burial record may preserve a moment of dynastic improvisation. In 2015, the British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves closely examined those scanned surfaces and argued that faint linear traces visible beneath the painted plaster on the north and west walls looked like the outlines of sealed doorways. He did not claim to have opened a hidden chamber. He claimed that the surface topography itself appeared to preserve architectural features that had been cut, blocked, plastered, and then painted over. This was a specific technical argument based on visual and relief data, not a story invented for spectacle. Reeves then advanced a much larger interpretation. He proposed that KV-62 might be only the outer part of a larger tomb, and that the concealed continuation could belong to a royal woman from the Amarna period, perhaps even Nefertiti. That proposal exploded because it joined two irresistible mysteries. Tutankhamun's tomb was the most famous burial in archaeology, and Nefertiti's undisputed tomb has never been found. Put those together, and the story seemed almost too perfect. But the importance of Reeves' argument was not that it named Nefertiti. The importance was that it reframed KV-62 as a potentially reused monument. Reeves argued that the tomb, its plan, orientation, and decorative features made more sense if the complex had originally been cut for a queen, and only later adapted for the burial of Tutankhamun after his sudden death. That idea did not begin with him in an absolute sense. The small scale of the tomb had long invited questions. What Reeves contributed was an integrated interpretation based on architecture, decoration, and scan evidence. According to that reading, the visible burial chamber could have been only the front section of a more extensive funerary suite, extending beyond the north wall, while the west side might preserve another sealed space. Whether or not the specific identification with Nefertiti is correct, the underlying question became unavoidable. Was the tomb telling us that Tutankhamun had been placed inside a structure first intended for somebody else? The architecture gave that hypothesis at least some traction. KV-62 turns to the right, a feature that some scholars have noted is more commonly associated in this period with tombs of queens than with those of kings. That point should not be exaggerated. Architectural conventions in ancient Egypt were strong, but they were not unbreakable laws, and single features rarely prove ownership by themselves. Still, the orientation fits the broader sense that the tomb is unusual. Its scale is modest. Its layout is compressed. The decorative program is limited. If you imagine a high-status non-royal or queenly burial later appropriated for a king, some aspects begin to look more coherent. Yet architecture alone cannot settle the matter. Ancient tombs were altered. Burials were rushed. Plans changed. The key question was whether the walls themselves preserved evidence of a hidden continuation. That is why imaging technology became so central. Once the suggestion of blocked doorways was made, the issue moved from stylistic debate into testable physical inquiry. If there were voids behind the walls, remote sensing might detect them. If there were none, the theory would weaken substantially. In late 2015, Egyptian authorities authorized a series of non-invasive tests. Thermographic work carried out in November reported temperature differences on parts of the northern wall, results that were described as potentially consistent with an open space behind the surface. Temperature anomalies alone do not prove a chamber. Variations can be caused by materials, moisture, surface conditions, or local structure. But in a tomb where a hidden doorway had already been proposed, even a suggestive anomaly drew global attention. Later that month, the Japanese radar specialist Hirokatsu Watanabe conducted ground-penetrating radar scans inside the tomb. The subsequent public statements were dramatic. Egyptian officials said the preliminary results suggested the presence of empty spaces beyond the decorated north and west walls, and further suggested possible metallic and organic substances within those spaces. That language electrified the media because organic, in a funerary context, naturally implies the possibility of human remains, wood, textile, resin, or other burial materials. For a moment, the hypothesis of a hidden continuation to KV-62 appeared to have moved from intriguing theory to probable discovery. But radar is not magic. Ground-penetrating radar can be extremely powerful, especially in archaeology, yet its results depend on calibration, materials, geometry, background interference, and interpretation. A signal is not a room until it survives scrutiny. That scrutiny arrived quickly. In 2016, a second radar survey involving National Geographic-supported technicians failed to replicate Watanabe's conclusions. Instead of confirming hidden chambers, the new survey produced results that were at best inconclusive and at worst contradictory. Here, the story became more interesting, not less. In public imagination, science often looks like a straight line from question to answer. In practice, especially in difficult field conditions, it often looks like disagreement between data sets. The issue was no longer just whether chambers existed. It became whether one team had detected real subsurface features, or whether the earlier apparent anomalies were artifacts of methodology, angle, material behavior, or signal processing. At conferences and in reporting, the contrast between the surveys was stark. One set of results had encouraged talk of hidden spaces. The next did not support that claim. The mystery survived, but it changed character. It was no longer simply a tale of a lost chamber. It had become a case study in how archaeological technology can produce ambiguous evidence inside a highly complex environment. To understand why the burial chamber was such a difficult testing ground, it helps to remember what radar was being asked to do. Tutankhamun's burial chamber is small and crowded. The walls are painted and plastered over limestone. The chamber also contains major stone features, including the quartzite sarcophagus that occupies a large part of the central space. Radar waves interact with material boundaries, voids, electrical properties, and geometry. In ideal situations, strong reflections can reveal cavities, walls, or subsurface changes with clarity. In non-ideal settings, waves can scatter, reflect along surfaces, bounce off large objects, and generate echoes that resemble meaningful structures. This does not make radar unreliable. It means interpretation must be cautious, especially when the space is sacred, confined, decorated, and inaccessible to destructive verification. The challenge in KV-62 was not merely to collect signals, but to distinguish genuine architectural discontinuities from misleading reflections generated by the chamber itself. That distinction matters because an apparent doorway in a radargram can be either a physical reality or a false pattern produced by complicated wave behavior. The next major step came in 2018, when a new and more comprehensive investigation was carried out by a team coordinated through the Polytechnic University of Turin and the University of Turin. According to the published account, the team employed 3 ground-penetrating radar systems using multiple frequency bands, from low to high, with dense sampling and scans taken in both vertical and horizontal directions. This matters because one common criticism of earlier work was that the chamber demanded a more systematic multi-frequency approach. Lower frequencies can penetrate deeper, but at lower resolution. Higher frequencies can offer finer detail over shallower distances. By combining them, the investigators aimed to resolve the contradictions left by the earlier surveys. The fieldwork covered the tomb carefully, and the report later summarized the central conclusion in clear terms. There was no evidence of hidden chambers immediately adjacent to Tutankhamun's burial chamber. The study also proposed a reason for earlier anomalies, suggesting that some signals may have been ghost reflections traveling along wall surfaces or influenced by the material properties of the plaster and the stone features inside the room. That conclusion is one of the most important points in the entire story because it is often distorted online. The 2018 study did not quietly disappear. A paper presenting the results was later published in the Journal of Cultural Heritage. Its conclusion was not that every mystery around KV-62 had been solved forever in all possible respects. Its conclusion was narrower and more technical. The radar data did not support the existence of hidden chambers immediately adjacent to the burial chamber walls under investigation. That is a strong finding, and it significantly weakened the most literal form of the hidden room hypothesis. But it still left open broader historical questions about the tomb's original planning and reuse. This distinction matters. A scholar can reject hidden chambers behind the painted walls and still accept that KV-62 may have been adapted from a tomb intended for someone else. Conversely, one can remain interested in subtle architectural irregularities without claiming that Nefertiti lies 3 feet away behind the north wall. The best historical work often lives in that middle space, where evidence trims sensational claims without eliminating the deeper puzzle. The decoration of the burial chamber is another reason the puzzle endured. The north wall, in particular, has been central to debate. It depicts scenes connected to Tutankhamun's funerary transition, including the opening of the mouth ritual and encounters with deities of the afterlife. One figure, Ai, appears in the role of king performing ritual for the deceased Tutankhamun. Some scholars, including Reeves, have argued that close inspection suggests alterations to facial features or details that might indicate the scene was reworked. In the strongest form of that argument, the decoration could preserve traces of an original owner whose identity was modified when the chamber was reassigned. This is a serious hypothesis, but it remains debated. Painted surfaces in ancient tombs are complex objects. Restoration history, plaster texture, visual expectation, digital enhancement, and surface wear can all influence interpretation. What can be said more safely is that the chamber's decoration fits a burial carried out under pressure at a politically sensitive moment. Whether that pressure involved simple haste, ideological transition, or the appropriation of an unfinished or completed space remains the crucial question. There is also a broader historical reason that the Nefertiti theory gained such force. Nefertiti is not merely a famous queen. She stands at the heart of the Amarna era, one of the most disruptive phases in Egyptian history. Her image survives in abundance, but the final circumstances of her life and burial remain unresolved. Some scholars have associated her with a later ruler under another name. Others have argued different identities or outcomes. In public culture, she represents the missing piece of a dynasty that collapsed into deliberate forgetting. So when a plausible, if unproven, proposal suggested that her burial could lie within the architectural envelope of Tutankhamun's tomb, the story drew enormous energy from more than radar readings alone. It drew energy from a century of fascination with absences in the record. Yet fascination is not evidence. The more responsible way to frame the issue is this. Reeves' broader interpretation linked a real architectural anomaly to a historically meaningful candidate, but the identification of the hidden occupant was always much more speculative than the observation that the tomb itself looked unusual. What then can be stated with confidence? First, Tutankhamun's tomb really is unusually small and unusual and planned for a royal burial of its date. Second, the burial took place in a period of dynastic instability and likely under time pressure. Third, high-resolution wall data did lead Nicholas Reeves to propose the existence of sealed architectural features behind painted plaster. Fourth, early non-invasive tests in 2015 appeared consistent, enough with that possibility to trigger worldwide attention. Fifth, later radar work in 2016 failed to confirm the earlier result. Sixth, the most comprehensive published radar study from 2018 concluded that no hidden chambers lie immediately adjacent to the surveyed walls. Those are solid anchor points. Around them swirl interpretations that range from cautious to speculative. The claim that a lost queen certainly waits beyond the wall is not established. The claim that the tomb was perfectly straightforward from the beginning is also difficult to maintain. The historical truth is more interesting because it lies between those extremes. KV-62 may be a reused tomb without containing unopened chambers. It may preserve traces of altered planning without preserving a surviving secret room. And it may continue to provoke debate precisely because the evidence supports complexity rather than a clean ending. The conservation issue explains why the matter remains unresolved in the public imagination. If this were a bare, rock-cut chamber of little importance, invasive confirmation might be easier to justify, but the walls of KV-62 are among the most famous decorated surfaces in archaeology. Drilling even a small inspection hole into a painted wall is not a trivial act. Conservators must weigh the possible gain in knowledge against irreversible physical intervention in a World Heritage Site. That caution is reasonable. At the same time, the refusal to move from non-invasive methods to direct verification has allowed the mystery to persist in a uniquely modern form. The wall cannot be opened casually, yet the technology used to test it produces results that non-specialists can easily overread. This leaves a perfect vacuum for sensational storytelling. Every ambiguous line becomes a door. Every conflicting survey becomes a cover-up. Every conservative archaeological decision becomes a suppression of truth. In reality, what we are watching is a tension between the ethics of preservation and the desire for certainty. Archaeology often advances by patient limits, not dramatic gestures. The irony is that Tutankhamun's tomb is important, even if no hidden chamber exists at all. The find transformed modern archaeology because of what it preserved, not because of what it might still conceal. Carter's excavation documented one of the richest royal assemblages ever found. The objects illuminated kingship, daily life, ritual, craftsmanship, international contacts, hunting, warfare, religion, embalming, and the economics of royal display. The tomb also revealed the human vulnerability of a king who died before securing a long political legacy. The lavish burial goods contrast with the compressed architecture, and that contrast itself is historically meaningful. T suggests a state capable of mobilizing extraordinary funerary wealth, while still responding to a sudden death with architectural compromise. That combination tells us something about how Egyptian kingship functioned under strain. The royal image had to be preserved at all costs, even if the burial container had to be adapted in haste. In that sense, the tomb's very awkwardness may be one of its most revealing features. It is also worth remembering how unusual it is that the debate depends so heavily on modern imaging rather than ancient testimony. No surviving inscription says, in simple terms, that Tutankhamun was buried in a recycled queen's tomb. No text identifies a sealed continuation hidden behind the north wall. This is not because the Egyptians necessarily meant to deceive future archaeologists. It is because royal burials were never built for transparent explanation to outsiders. Tomb architecture, decoration, and closure were ritual acts. Once the burial was completed, secrecy and protection were built into the very purpose of the monument. Modern archaeology reconstructs those intentions indirectly through layout, workmanship, material relationships, and context. That is why a surface seam or a radar anomaly can matter so much. In a tomb without explanatory paperwork, physical clues carry unusual weight. But physical clues are also vulnerable to overinterpretation. The scientific discipline lies in resisting the temptation to let one intriguing trace answer every unanswered question. This is where the story becomes larger than Tutankhamun. It becomes a story about how discoveries are made and unmade in the modern world. A bold hypothesis is proposed from new imaging data. The media amplify the most dramatic possible version. Governments and institutions respond under global scrutiny. Preliminary findings are announced. Contradictory technical results follow. Specialists debate methods that the public cannot easily evaluate. A final paper appears with a narrower, more cautious conclusion than the headline that originally launched the story. By then, however, the mystery has developed a life of its own. The public remembers the possibility more vividly than the correction. This pattern is common in science and archaeology, but KV62 is an unusually perfect example because the subject was already iconic. Tutankhamun's tomb did not need a second life as a mystery, yet the hidden chamber debate gave it one, and in doing so revealed how modern attention can reshape the meaning of old evidence. And still, the hidden room theory refuses to die because the tomb itself invites it. The chamber is intimate enough to make proximity feel almost tangible. The north wall stands there with its painted figures, and once someone tells you to imagine a blocked passage behind it, the idea becomes difficult to shake. Archaeology is especially vulnerable to this kind of cognitive pull because the discipline often depends on learning to see significance in subtle irregularities. Great discoveries have been made by taking anomalies seriously, but science advances not by preferring anomalies, but by testing them against increasingly rigorous methods. In KV62, the anomaly was real enough to justify investigation. What remains disputed is the correct interpretation. Was the wall preserving an architectural memory of a sealed continuation? Were the apparent lines simply surface features that resemble a doorway under enhanced lighting and relief data? Did earlier radar actually detect something meaningful, or did the chamber generate misleading reflections that later methods explained away? These are technical questions, and technical questions rarely produce satisfying myths. The persistence of the debate also reflects a deeper truth about Tutankhamun himself. He is famous not because he was the most powerful king of Egypt, but because accident preserved his burial so well that modern culture elevated him into a symbol. His reign was short. His political achievements were limited compared with giants like Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, or Ramesses II. Yet his tomb became the gateway through which millions of people first encountered ancient Egypt. That imbalance between historical stature and archaeological fame creates a paradox. We know Tutankhamun visually and materially better than many more consequential pharaohs, yet his life and burial still sit within major uncertainties. The hidden chamber would be a spectacular addition to the story, but the existing facts are already enough to challenge the simplified image of the boy king in his treasure-filled tomb. What survives is not a neat royal monument. It is a compressed, improvised, politically charged burial from the aftermath of a religious revolution. So what did scientists actually find when they scanned King Tut's tomb? The most honest answer is that they found evidence of a problem before they found evidence of a solution. They found a tomb whose surfaces and geometry raised legitimate questions. They found thermal differences worth noting. One survey found radar signatures interpreted as cavities and possible material contrasts. A later survey could not confirm those readings. The most comprehensive published radar work concluded that no hidden chambers were present immediately beyond the examined walls, and that earlier results may have been caused by ghost reflections and complex wave behavior. That is less cinematic than they found a secret room. But it is far more revealing about how archaeology works. The scans did not uncover a lost queen. They exposed the limits of certainty inside one of the most emotionally charged sites on Earth. They showed that even in the most studied tomb in the world, the line between data and interpretation can remain surprisingly fragile. In the end, the greatest mystery of KV62 may not be whether a room is hidden behind the north wall. It may be why this small, irregular, hastily adapted tomb has continued to generate new questions a century after its discovery. Every generation seems to find a new Tutankhamun. Carter's miraculous king of gold, the post-war icon of museum exhibition, the medically examined young ruler, the child of the Amarna aftermath, the focus of digital conservation, the center of a radar controversy. Each version says as much about modern methods and modern desires as it does about the ancient burial itself. We want archaeology to produce final revelations, but more often it produces sharper forms of uncertainty. KV62 is the perfect monument for that lesson. Its treasures looked like closure. Its architecture looked like compromise. Its scans looked like possibility. Its best available science now looks like refusal. Yet the questions remain, not because the evidence is worthless, but because the evidence points toward a complicated truth. That complicated truth is still extraordinary. Tutankhamun was likely buried in a tomb that does not fully fit him. The monument may preserve the traces of reuse, adaptation, and political urgency. The wall data that triggered the hidden chamber theory were important enough to justify serious scientific testing. And the fact that the final published radar conclusion pushed back hard against the chamber hypothesis does not make the episode a failure. It makes it a rare instance in which global fascination forced archaeology to show its work in public, with all the friction, revision, and disappointment that real inquiry entails. The story is compelling precisely because it resists a perfect ending. There may be no sealed chamber behind the wall. There may never be a drilled verification hole. Nefertiti may lie elsewhere entirely, But the scans still change the history of Tutankhamun's tomb by proving that even the most celebrated archaeological sites remain interpretive battlegrounds, where old monuments and new technologies collide. If one day new methods, better imaging, or some future conservation decisions settle the question more decisively, the answer may turn out to be mundane. No chamber, no hidden queen, no second Carter moment. But even then, the debate will have done something valuable. It will have forced a much closer reading of the tomb's architecture, decoration, and historical context than many popular accounts ever attempted. And if, against present evidence, some sealed, continuation were ever identified after all, the reason it would matter so much is not just the possibility of treasure or fame. It would matter because it would rewrite our understanding of one of the most unstable transitions in Egyptian royal history. Either way, the scans already achieved something remarkable. They turned a monument people thought they knew into an active historical problem again. The painted figures on the wall have not changed. Ai still performs ritual before the dead king. The gods still welcome Tutankhamun into the next world. Visitors still stand in a chamber that feels smaller than legend prepared them for, but our understanding of that chamber is no longer as simple as it once seemed. The question is no longer whether the tomb is famous. The question is whether its fame hid the very thing that made it most historically revealing. The signs that this royal burial was shaped by emergency, adaptation, and unfinished dynastic business. That is the real mystery of King Tut's tomb. Not a guaranteed hidden room, but a tomb that keeps exposing how much uncertainty can survive inside the most famous archaeological discovery on Earth. If you want more evidence-based investigations into archaeology, ancient history, and the places where science collides with mystery, subscribe and stay with the channel because the next story begins where certainty ends.